Hello, I'm Ben Parsons. Just to put the video you're about to watch into context, it's a little snippet from my second year module, Early Modern Fantasies and Fears, which focuses on the supernatural and the way the supernatural changes as the late Middle Ages gives way to the Renaissance and the Civil War and the Restoration. And we study all range of things like witchcraft and demonic possession, as well as kind of murder and werewolves and a range of kind of peculiar things like that. The particular area this video is going to focus on is the ghost, with a little kind of insight into some of the ways in which ghosts undergo a kind of radical revision as the Middle Ages gives way to the early modern period. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. Hello and welcome to this brief taster lecture for English called Beyond the Grave, Beyond the Page, a Medieval Ghost Story. So ghost stories and ghosts often make us think about history, since they are at root all about the intrusion of the past into the present. Shades of Patroclus and Tiresias in the Iliad and the Odyssey, to the spectre of Hamlet's father, to Dickens' Marley and his Ghosts of Christmas, ghosts by their very nature disturb chronologies and cave in the borders between historical periods. Nevertheless, the ghost also has a history of its own. As an idea, it undergoes some important changes over time, as wider shifts in belief, politics, or culture impress their forms onto it. And one of the most important of these changes is the radical transition that happens at the end of the Middle Ages. As Catholicism gives way to Protestantism during the long, painful tussles of the Reformation, the ghost is both affected by and reflects wider movements in attitudes towards the supernatural. These changes can be seen vividly in a brief and revealing story I want to talk about here. Like a lot of stories, it reveals far more than it intends, and certainly more than its author would have wished to say. It's an early printed edition of John Merck's Festial. Although this is originally a medieval text written in the 14th century, this is a 16th century version of it, produced at Westminster by Wynkyn de Worde in about 1508. This particular copy is now held at Emmanuel College in Cambridge. At one point in his text, Merck tells us the following story. We find of an abbess that was a clean woman as for any deed of sin, but she had great lust to speak thereof. So when she was dead and buried in the church, the night after came fiends, and took up the body and beat it all over with burning whips from the navel upwards, so that it was black as any pitch. But from the navel downwards it shone as bright as the sun, and the fiends might do it no harm. And as the fiends beat her, she cried piteously, so that two of her sisters that were sextons were sore afraid. But either of them comforted the other, so that they went near, and they knew how things were. Then spoke the spirit to her sisters, and said, You know well that I was a clean maiden as for any deed, but I had a great lust to speak of sin. That part of me has great pain, as you may see. Therefore I pray you, sisters, pray for me, for by your prayers I may be helped, and beware by me in time coming. Now, this is obviously a ghost story. It deals with revenancy, the return of a dead person to the world of the living, in this case an abbess, a nun charged with overseeing a community of fellow nuns. In its basic narrative, it follows a form still recognisable now. Yet there are a lot of features in the story that visibly do not fit our expectations of ghosts, or which differ from the ways in which apparitions behave when we imagine their manifestations today. For instance, although it's described as a spirit, Merck's ghost is very emphatically bodily. It has a physical form, it is dragged from its grave, and it's capable of being wounded and of feeling pain. It is also self-aware and communicative. It can ask directly for help from the living and apparently expect to receive it. Though this story is recognisable as a ghost story, in other words, it is also equally the product of a culture and a line of reasoning that's very different from our own. To understand these aspects of Merck's apparition, it's worth thinking about what sort of book the Festial is, and a little bit about Merck himself. Now, this second point can be covered fairly quickly. Many medieval authors, we do not know a great deal about John Merck. He was a younger contemporary of Chaucer, active at the end of the 14th century and into the first decades of the 15th. He seems to die at around 1420. He was in religious orders, being part of the community of Augustinian canons at Lilleshall Abbey in Shropshire. That, however, is virtually all we know about him as a historical figure. As a writer, however, he comes a little more sharply into focus. It is obvious that he was worried about the level of knowledge and education in the clergy, and the capability of priests to perform their offices effectively for their public. Hence, he produced a whole sequence of resources for this particular group to help them carry out their work, to make sure they were properly equipped to serve the souls of their parishioners. His other major works are 2 handbooks for parish priests, one in English, one in Latin. The Festial is part of these efforts. It is a series of specimen sermons, presenting a complete sequence of model sermons for each of the major feast days on the medieval calendar. The idea is that preachers either recite Merck's texts verbatim for their own parishioners or adapt them as they see fit, following his examples. Now, the presence of stories involving hauntings, ghosts, revenants in the sober context of a sermon collection might seem quite odd to us. It is not really where we would expect to find blood-chilling tales of dead people returning from the grave and manifesting themselves to the living. Nevertheless, what Merck is doing here is actually not all that unusual by medieval standards. The use of brief stories such as these is quite a widespread technique in contemporary preaching. They are known as exempla or narrationes, and both words, both of which are Latin, describe brief exemplary stories used to illustrate a general moral point by a preacher. Of course, they have an entertaining function as well, serving as a device that ensures the congregation's emotive and imaginative faculties are stimulated as they hear about how to go about living their lives. But their chief purpose is argumentative, offering narrative proof of a general moral principle that the preacher wishes to put forward. So Merck's treatment of the ghost here is in some ways highly conventional, extending directly out of an established feature of medieval preaching. But the very conventionalization of the story is actually what makes it significant. What Merck shows above all is how secure the ghost had become as a conception, and how full and robust a series of meanings had formed around it by the late Middle Ages. The very fact that these stories have been brought into sermons reflects this circumstance. The sermon is, after all, an interpretive type of text, existing not merely to allocate meaning, but to reiterate and reinforce practices and moral categories and valuations. And the way in which Merck uses the ghost clearly serves this end at every step. Both of the ways in which the ghost manifests itself, physically and verbally, are obviously communicative, declaring her dual position as a clean woman who has nonetheless been compromised by sins of the mouth. That is, she liked to gossip about the sexual indiscretions of others, but remained innocent of such things herself, as a nun, of course. This is why her body is presented in the way that it is. She is burned from the waist up, but intact from the waist down, because her upper body is the part of her that is guilty, her lower being without sin, and so shining in its purity. The tormented physiology of the abbess, then, fulfills a symbolic purpose, serving to mark her and classify her as a particular type of sinner, guilty of a particular set of offences. On the other hand, her speech also carries out an obviously explanatory function, disclosing the significance of the mutilations it suffers. The ghost is then both a sort of text and its own interpretation. It both requires and performs reading in the context of the story. Perhaps more interesting still is the fact that the abbess inhabits a reciprocal relationship with the nuns, the sextons she visits, neatly encapsulated by her plea, "I pray you, sisters, pray for me." In the first place, she appears in order to educate the 2 sisters of the perils of salacious gossip, yet at the same time they are able to assist her in her pains, as by your prayers I may be helped. There is then a mutually supportive connection between living and dead here, one in which both are able to benefit, giving the other instruction or prayer. Although Merck doesn't mention it by name, what underpins this sense of the ghost is the doctrine of purgatory and the cottage industry of votive offerings and pardons that had built up around it since it had been accepted by the Catholic Church in 1274. The burning whips are obviously purgatorial penalties. The divided body that the abbess is assigned puts her midway between sin and salvation. And the fact the abbess is able to appeal to the sisters for help at all and can expect her petition to be effective shows that she's an inhabitant of this intermediate space. She is a soul in purgatory. She's not quite in heaven, she's not quite in hell. She's imperfect, but able to be redeemed eventually through punishment and through the prayer of the living. But the Festial shows that this is more than just a kind of technical, abstract concern, demonstrating how fully purgatory had become as a means of understanding, containing, and even exploiting the ghost. In the story, the ghost of the abbess is not an object of fear or lasting dread. It's something that can be understood, approached, and even ultimately reasoned with, despite the initial shock prompted by its manifestation. Purgatory has obviously then provided a means by which these supernatural experiences can be integrated comfortably and usefully into late medieval faith and practice. The haunting in Merck's story is not disruptive or particularly fearful. Instead, it's immediately intelligible, describable, and above all, resolvable using the equipment that Orthodox ritual provides for the nuns, and by extension for the preacher and his congregation as well. So what you can see in this story is that the late Middle Ages had managed to come to terms with the ghost, or at least had succeeded in developing a culture whose mechanisms could contain hauntings and fix their value. Although we would not call these rational in any modern sense of the word, it possessed through purgatory and its associated practices like prayer for the dead, a well-developed machinery that allowed it to cope with the phenomena of ghosts, successfully explaining, processing, and capitalizing on supernatural experiences of this kind. However, this is also the point at which the Festial discloses more than its author and its printer supposed. In many ways, the Festial is a bridge between the medieval and the modern. It may have been written at the end of the 14th century by a man who died shortly before the Wars of the Roses broke out, but it continued to be read and copied well into the 16th century, up to the very brink of the Reformation itself. It's probably the most widely published English text in the 1510s and 1520s. We know of at least 19 editions of it now, which is testament to its continuing value and usefulness for early modern religious culture. But it's not simply absorbed into this later period without problem or pause. Emmanuel College copy is one of several early printed books to have been hastily customised at some stage in its history, in the second half of the 16th century most likely, whether to accommodate shifting patterns of belief in the Tudor period or perhaps to register hostility to medieval Catholic practice. Either way, it shows how large a bulldozer the events of the Reformation drove through the ceremonial and doctrinal architecture that supported the medieval ghost. Although the title Pope is one obvious lightning rod for these attacks, as you can see in the image there, it's been crossed out. The nameless editor who's responsible for these deletions takes particular aim at purgatory too, scratching over the word itself and blacking out references to related issues such as indulgence or prayers for the dead. So hence, in a later section from the Festial, this nameless editor not only strikes out the word Pope when it occurs, but any statement referring to the power of prayer to give souls in purgatory relief from their suffering. Now, by modifying the text in this way, Merck's later reader is acting within the new limits of orthodoxy set out under Edward VI and later reiterated by Elizabeth I. Both of these monarchs sought to dismantle the entire edifice of medieval material piety and enshrine the principle that Holy Scripture containeth all things necessary to salvation, in place of what they call the doctrine of school authors. Hence the Articles of 1553 that Edward VI drew up specifically target purgatory as a fond thing vainly feigned, and even the more conservative version, published in 1561, takes aim at private masses and setting up of candles to care for the dead. But the rigour, the thoroughness, even the violence of Merck's reader shows how totally purgatory was placed out of bounds by these new rules. It has effectively become a taboo or a flashpoint, suitable only for attack and obliteration, inviting the nib of a pen to scratch it out. So what Merck's little story about this haunting shows us is a wide range of things. It reveals to us not just how medieval people thought about ghosts, but how they were able to make peace with the idea of the ghost, to understand and exploit it, using the machinery of ritual and belief. At the same time, of course, it also shows us how this same machinery was forfeit in the 16th century, paving the way for our own conception of spectres as something unknowable, uncontrollable, unreasonable, and disturbing. But beyond these points, it also shows us what studying ghost stories in itself can reveal. How the present thinks about the past, how the past filters into the present, how the two interrelate and interact with one another, how the borders between historical periods will always collapse and be compromised, and how the ghost is a symbol of this collapse. So the Festial is in itself a sort of ghost text, a dead voice haunting the present of its unknown Tudor reader, one that resists his attempts to exorcise it and consign it to the past completely. Okay, thank you for listening.